Happy New Year, everyone. Hope y'all are doing well. Let's start off 2024 with a bit of fun here on the channel, with the next episode of Overrated, Underrated, or Properly Rated. Inspired by creator Barry McCockiner, the premise of these videos is to ask you, the community, for my opinion on certain players, teams, metas, coaches, or whatever else is on your mind from past or present, and then I tell you if I think they are overrated, underrated, or properly rated in the eyes of this community. If I didn't get to your question, I do apologize, but I would definitely recommend checking out the other videos in the description in case I've already talked about the player you asked about. So let's get into question number 1. We have Rascal. He was a legend in Season 3 on Echo, but didn't have the best performance in Season 4 on a struggling Philly. Flex God or one trick? So I don't know where this one trick is coming from, but that is definitely not the case with Rascal. Yes, he maybe wasn't the greatest outside of his shock seasons, but in his prime, he was an absolutely incredible player, super consistent. I mean, always has been one of the best Mei players in the game's history. Like you said, really, really good Echo as well. But don't forget about what he did in the GOATS era too. You can say whatever you want about the skill level during that time, but you can't really argue with how great he was on Brig as well as BAP. Rascal was a pretty intelligent player, pretty innovative for his time, and the Shock definitely are not what they are today if it weren't for some of his contributions. So I'm gonna say he's properly rated, although one day, if the slander continues from a lot of people I've been seeing recently, maybe he'll end up being underrated. Anyway, next is Shaz. I feel like he is so underrated when he was one of the better players for his time. So yeah, I'm kind of actually with you there. I think that Shaz is very quickly forgotten as his career ended after 2020, but in his prime, he was a super consistent flex support. He was never going to be a top dog, never one of those super bloodthirsty, game-changing flex supports, but you could count on him to get you a couple of good plays every game. And to this day, he is still one of the all-time leaders on the healing leaderboard. And regardless of what his main support partner was looking like, Shaz usually formed one half of a relatively reliable support line for the first half of the Overwatch League. I don't think people give Shaz enough credit for sticking around the scene for as long as he did and always being serviceable. Again, maybe not an all-time great player, but pretty solid and someone who definitely could have still had a career if he didn't choose to retire after 2020. So I'm gonna say that Shaz is slightly underrated. GNR asks, can you please do Junin? All the hype around him was too much and I think he underperformed. So yeah, to a certain extent, definitely did not play as good as he could have, but I do think this kind of applies to every member of the 2023 Shock, as the team itself was just a major flop. And I'd argue even through all of that Junin looked like one of the better players on the team, and maybe if he had better help, he would have given us a better look. It can be really hard to judge tank players when the situation around them is kind of crappy. And as shown by the rest of his career, both before and after the league, he's usually a pretty good player. So I'm going to give you an NA for this one. I can't really judge Junin off of this one weird season. He could have played better, yeah, but I'm not going to say he's overrated. Shiny Rayquaza says, nice name by the way, alexyOWL during his time on the Spark was often overshadowed by Shy, and his time on the Justice was decent and he doesn't get a lot of recognition. And I'd be inclined to agree with you. alexyOWL was very good on the Spark, but it was all about Shy and Gushwei back then, and on the Justice he was a solid player, but didn't really get the respect he deserved because the Justice were quite frankly an irrelevant team. But both the eye test and the numbers suggest that he was a really great player. alexyOWL never got a fair shot to be a leader on a good team. His talent's always going underappreciated by scouts and with analysts alike. He should have been on the MVP ballot in 2023, and while I do think there is like a good number of alexyOWL advocates out there, he still doesn't get talked about nearly enough. As he showed on the Spark team in that playoff run, he could be a difference maker. I think that alexyOWL is maybe a little bit underrated. Blair McKenzie wants to know, Chara, main support of the Charge. He was an important part of the tournament win for the Charge and was always a serviceable player alongside Shu. His Brig was also very, very good. Honestly, I've never been that big of a fan of Chara. I think that he got the privilege of playing on a Charge team that was pretty loaded at the time in 2020. He did make a bit of a difference, I won't lie to you. It seemed like they were better after Neptuno couldn't come back for his visa issues and whatnot. But just the idea of him being a real difference maker doesn't sit right with me, as there were so many other talented pieces that were doing a lot of the work, like Krong and Eileen and Shu. Chara's always been more of a background guy to me. Very smart and clearly a very important leader in-game, but I just can't get behind the idea of him being a real impact player. He just has never impressed me with his gameplay. He's always kind of existed. So I'm going to say that he's properly rated. ParkerDude says space. He does not get enough credit for how good he was on the Gladiators, and I think that it even extends to the coaches too with how he wasn't played during Jotes. Yeah, I'm not sure what happened. Space kind of just stopped being talked about after 2022. Honestly, by the beginning of 2022, he was an afterthought, but Space genuinely was a very good player. Maybe even the best off-tank in Western history in some people's eyes. It's up for debate, but he's definitely up there. Space always played super consistently when given the chance. Even going into 2022 on Junker Queen, he even looked good on her. Space was someone that would not let you down. He was an excellent Diva player and even a good Sigma in his prime. He could hang in there with all the best. I remember him dominating both on the Valiant and the Gladiator so many different times. His hero pool wasn't always the greatest. He did have some weaknesses for sure where he wasn't as useful and he had to be subbed out, but you could almost always rely on Space, and people literally just stopped talking about him for no reason. I don't know what happened there, so I think I'm gonna go with underrated. Next up is Andrew, who says, inspired by your recent best and worst roster, 2 worst rosters involved Myungbong. He was definitely a talented player with some high points, but curious where you rank him overall. So, yeah, if we're being truthful, Myungbong had one good season. His only claim to fame is in 2020 on Boston. And credit goes where it's due. I mean, he absolutely carried that team. It was like him and Punk the entire season. And if it weren't for his efforts, they may not win any games at all. He was a generational prospect, and it seemed like he was on the right foot at first. But after 2020, he really didn't do anything in his career. On 21 Boston, he was super irrelevant. And we all know what happened on New York the following year. He was out of the league within weeks, just not a very good player anymore, and I think a lot of it has to do with the fact that he was mostly only good at Ana. His Zen play and his Bat play left so much to be desired, and he basically just carried a bad Boston team that had no other help. But I think most people recognize that. We appreciate what he did early on, but we also see that he didn't do much in his career to distinguish himself as an all-time great, so Myungbong is properly rated. Next up is Cactus. What are your thoughts on Flora? I think he performed relatively well considering the circumstances, but always felt like he was subpar despite the potential shown. Flora was pretty up and down in his career, mostly only having a bad season in 2022 on that disastrous New York team, but outside of that, you really can't complain with what Flora showed us. He was really good for a New York team that was trying to rebuild one year, and on the Justice last year, he was a very reliable hitscan and Hanzo player. He had a couple of games in both of his prime seasons where we were like, oh my god, this is his coming out party. Flora is here. He's going to be one of the next all-time greats. But it was just lightning in a bottle usually, and it never seemed to last, and his potential was never truly reached. But at the same time, I think due to his comeback season in 2023, people have regained that ability to appreciate Flora, and we maybe understand that 2022 is just a crappy situation, so I can't really go on either side of the needle, so I'll just say that Flora is adequately appreciated. Now we're gonna get into metas. Zach wants to know my thoughts on GOATs. I have viewpoints from both sides on this matter. I think the GOATs enthusiasts are in the right when they say that peak GOATs with 2 top teams is some of the best professional Overwatch you will ever witness. I agree wholeheartedly there, as all those games with the Shock and Titans were absolute cinema, amongst others. There's just so much teamwork that has to go into GOATs. Everything has to be so precise with your communication and timing, and I just love that. I love that the game is being played in its purest form with teamwork in mind like that. I love the comboing that goes on, how fun it can be to analyze GOATs, but at the same time, I think the GOATs haters bring up a good point in the sense that this meta lasted for way too long. You can't even sit there and tell me with a straight face that this meta lasting for like over a year was not healthy for the game. I mean, it's not all their fault. The pros were just playing what was best at the time. It's Blizzard's fault for not properly balancing their game and whatnot. but still, it was just there for way too long. It provided a lot of fatigue that was super exhausting, but also something I'd like to add that doesn't always get brought up is that GOATS, if it wasn't between two of the top teams, was terrible. While it is true that we saw a lot of peak games with two top teams, the opposite also holds to be true. When bad teams played GOATS, or even mid teams, it was boring. It was painful even. Anytime it wasn't between two top teams, you're just clicking off of the Twitch or YouTube stream right away, and that goes without question. It's not fun to watch bad teams play GOATs. And the sad truth is, the number of bad games heavily outweighs the number of good games in terms of ratio. So, as much as I did enjoy GOATs at its peak, there was just so many other horrible times that did not make it worth it. And I think too many people praise GOATs as like this untouchable meta, so I'm going to say that GOATs is a little bit overrated. Next up, we're going to talk about Admiral, because I got a lot of Admiral questions in my most recent community post. I was actually surprised that so many people wanted to know my opinion on this guy. And to be honest with you, I appreciate Admiral. I think that he did a lot of the dirty work for the London Spitfire the last 2 seasons, and he definitely helped rescue them from an otherwise crappy situation beforehand by heavily increasing the consistency that we saw at the support position for London compared to their disastrous first year together with this core. I do think that Admiral maybe isn't the best with his hero pool, and that his Lucio being really strong covers up other weaknesses in his game, but I can't really hold that against the guy when Lucio was all London ever asked him to play. And I think that Nano Assassin sums up my words perfectly, where he was overshadowed by a lot of other big personalities like Hottie and Landon and whatnot, but he was still doing his thing for the most part. He didn't always play that great, and he did cost his team some games, I can admit that, but generally over the stretch of 2 seasons, I think he was more so reliable than unreliable. And because he's on main support and there's these other big-time names on the team that make you forget about him, I'd argue that Admiral is ever so slightly underrated. Loot Bug Looter says, need to throw in Jinmu. This guy was a maniac who won and lost countless games for the Hunters in his prime. Absolutely legendary. So Jinmu is one of those guys where you either love him or can't understand why he was in the league for as long as he was. I personally love the guy. He wasn't some legendary player by any stretch, but you can't deny that he was able to stay in the league for a long time, and clearly he was doing something right if Chengdu continued to have an interest in him. Yeah, his hero pool wasn't the greatest, but he was good at what he played. Every single season, this guy would do something that you'd remember him for, whether it be helping to popularize this team early in the GOATS era, or just being that funny Pharah player when Chengdu were at their peak. Jinmu was always around, and I'd like to think that there's an equal amount of love and hate for him. People realized that he was reliable and he had a good career, but he's also not that great, so properly rated. Next up is Monk. Did a lot for Chengdu and Hangzhou, but wasn't given enough credit / love for his plays. So up until recently, I would have said who really cares about Monk? Yeah, he's either overrated or properly rated, but my entire perspective changed after what I saw in Hangzhou and the World Cup afterwards in 2023. Tournament Monk is a thing of legend. I mean, it is unironically a term that the community is throwing around now, and for good reason. The stuff he was doing with Ana on the Spark and on the Chinese World Cup team is just mind-blowing to me, outplaying some of the best flex supports in the game at the current time. He wasn't always the greatest regular season player, but when the big games came around, he dialed into a level that I didn't even think was possible. Unironically, one of the best players of all time in the clutch. And yet, it's hard for him to always get the love he deserves because there's just a bunch of other popular Chinese players out there, like your Guxues and your Shais and your Leaves. So I'm unironically, maybe this is recency bias, but I'm gonna say that Monk is maybe a little underrated after his recent heroics. Who.Jimbo says Renko. I feel like everybody only liked him because of the whole smile thing, but how good is he actually? So I don't think it's just the smile thing. In general, he's a really good guy that people are attached to, But I don't think it's fair to actually judge Renko for playing literally half a season. The Shock panic signed him, and their support situation was a mess as he'd be swapping between flex and main support constantly, going on the bench sometimes. I think it is extremely unfair to judge him off of that short time on that messy Shock team. He had some good moments, he had some bad moments in a rookie season where he came aboard mid-season. I just don't think there's enough there to really give you a general opinion. I think he was pretty decent before he joined the Overwatch League, but from an OWL standpoint, there's just not enough there, so this one gets an NA. Tekkanon says, fact fiction from the Valiant. I think he was underrated because he was able to help out the Valiant when they needed a tank. Initially, when after his time with the Valiant came to an end, I was kind of in the same boat as you. As a former Valiant fan, I appreciated what he did. He filled in the shoes of Fate perfectly. He was the tank player that team needed to at least kind of salvage their season. He was good. But at the same time, I did hear, I forget where it was, I think it might have been Platchat and Bren or something like that, but I heard somewhere that Fact Fiction maybe wasn't the best teammate. He had a lot of comm issues where he'd, I guess, go radio silent when the team wasn't doing well and or losing, and that's just a really bad attitude to have, regardless of if you're a tank player or some kind of other teammate. That's not very good or healthy for your team environment. And because of that, as it seems to be somewhat true from a reliable source, I'd argue that if anything, Fact Fiction is overrated, and maybe the Valiant could have done just as well, if not better, with a different tank player. Then we have Eclipse, who gave a plethora of names. I'm just going to pick out one. I think that Slime is an interesting guy to talk about. I think in general that he is maybe properly rated, but overrated by GOATs and or Titans fans. Here's how I see it. Slime was a phenomenal Lucio during his time. He, I believe, won a Role Star that year. He was really good at Lucio and GOATs, but that is literally his only claim to fame. He could not adapt with the game. He couldn't play any other supports well. He got multiple job opportunities, but he was terrible on Florida, and he got benched on the Dynasty. He just didn't do anything to impress, and I think that people are giving him too much credit because he was phenomenal at GOATs. So I think that Slime is most definitely overrated. And finally, to end this video, Choy just started OWL last year. That's unfortunate. And I picked the Guangzhou Charge as my favorite team. It's been fun to watch through the first part of the season or the first few games. The rest went downhill. I maybe have an unpopular opinion with Choy. I think that he doesn't get enough love for sure, like most people would argue, because he played in APAC on a crappy Guangzhou team, but I think people overly praise Choy. As skilled as he was, when he did actually get the opportunities to shine, he could never deliver. He played great most of the time, but I never really felt him when Guangzhou had a chance to be something greater, like in the play-ins in 2022, getting reverse swept by Chengdu, or coming up short in the knockouts this season with a chance to go to mid-season madness. When the lights were at their brightest, Guangzhou disappeared, and while all of that can't be placed on Choy, I think to a certain extent there were matches where he wasn't playing up to par as we've seen in a lot of the regular season games out there. I don't know. I know it's in a really tough situation for him playing on the Guangzhou Charge. I mean, God bless him for signing a contract there, but he should have been able to do more, and that has to impact his legacy at least a little bit. So I think it all balances out in the end. I wouldn't say that he's underrated because of the stuff that happened with the choking, but I can't say he's overrated either because he never really got a fair shot. He was on Guangzhou teams who constantly were facing dysfunction, and if he was on a better team, maybe the results would have been better. So I'll say properly rated, although I would have loved to see what he could do if he played on an actual contender. And that's going to do it for this one. If you enjoyed it and you maybe want to see these videos come out a bit more frequently in the future, give this video a big fat thumbs up, subscribe to the channel if you're new, and leave a comment on who I should leave my opinion on next. And until next time, this is ATP, signing out. Peace.